Hello viewers, 4DIYers here with another video for everyone. In this brief video here, I'll be showing you how to replace a water pump on a Dodge Ram 5.7 liter V8. This is a 2006 1500 four-wheel drive model. Water pumps have different fail points. This can be a faulty bearing which will typically make a noise when the engine is running. This may or may not be followed by a faulty seal causing a coolant leak out the vent hole of the bearing. The seal between the block and pump casing can also fail, again causing a coolant leak. And finally is an impeller, where it's deteriorated, broken, or spinning on the shaft. If your coolant level is constantly dropping, there are ways to help find a leak if it's not prominently visible. I do have videos for this. One would be using a dye and a UV light, and the other one is using a cooling system pressure tester. Here is a couple different examples using the tools. One is a UV light and the other one is a pressure testing kit. Both of these can be purchased from OEM Tools and can be found at Mobile Distributor Supply. Links for these will be included in the video description. Remove the two bolts at the top of the expansion and washer fluid tank. These are 10mm. Removal processes may vary as I do have a cold air intake. First was removing that cold air intake. This required disconnecting some mounting points, then removing the air filter. Once that air filter was removed, I was able to access the other mounting points. The gear clamp was then loosened at the throttle body and the intake tube was pulled off. Finally, the barrier around the cold air intake is then removed. Here's a view at the bottom of the washer fluid tank. You can see there's a sensor and a washer pump. The electrical connectors here are required to be disconnected. The hose from the washer pump will need to be pulled off. Keep in mind that fluid will come out after that hose is disconnected. At the top of the expansion tank is a small rubber hose that simply pulls off the reservoir. Once that tank is lifted out, here you can see the electrical connectors. These have a red clip which is required to be pulled back before pulling the connector straight off. Now is draining the cooling system. There is a drain at the bottom of the radiator on the driver's side. It's a 16mm. Have a bucket handy to catch any of the old coolant and wait for the system to drain. Then dispose of the coolant properly. Remove the two bolts holding down the fan shroud. There will be one on each side by the top, and they are 12mm. To determine which hose goes where and their orientation, I used a paint marker to label each side for an easy reference. Then using large interlocking pliers, remove the hose clamps on each side. I did find a couple of the factory clamps were cracked, which can result in a coolant system leak. These clamps will be changed out for gear clamps instead. Even if yours aren't broken, I would highly recommend the upgrade. For the clamp that was broke, I used locking pliers to hold half the clamp open. Then using a small pry tool, I slowly worked the hose and clamp off. The fan shroud can then be lifted up and pulled away from the radiator. I was replacing the radiator as well. It does make the job easier for replacing the water pump if removed. The oil cooler was unbolted from the bottom of the radiator. A 10mm wrench and socket is required here. Then drop down the oil cooler. Now is removing the two bolts holding down the radiator, one on each side. Both of these are 10mm. The AC condenser is then unbolted from the radiator. A 10mm socket is required here. There's a bolt on one side, and the other side has tabs which fit into a slot. Finally, the radiator is lifted out of the truck. If you are keeping it, place it somewhere safe so it doesn't get damaged. Lift out the fan shroud. I wasn't having much luck removing the clutch fan. Typically it's done by using a large adjustable wrench or a regular wrench, then hit it with a hammer to shock it free. I already purchased a new clutch fan as preventative maintenance. It will need to be removed after to transfer the fan blade over. Using a 3/8 drive ratchet, clip it onto the slot in the tensioner, pull the tensioner back, and then remove the serpentine belt from the smoothest pulley. In this case it was the water pump pulley. Here's a quick view of how the serpentine belt is routed before it's removed. Now remove that belt. Once most of the stuff is out of the way, now the lower radiator hose is removed from the water pump. Again, it has the same style clamp. Use large interlocking pliers to open the clamp and disconnect. While I'm here, the heater core hoses are also disconnected. These have the same style clamps, just smaller versions. Again, I used a paint marker to label each of the hoses. Using a 15mm socket, remove the serpentine belt tensioner. Remove the 4 nuts holding down the brace bracket for the alternator and AC compressor. Have a drain pan handy under the front of the engine to catch any coolant when the pump is removed. Then remove all the pump fasteners. Use the new pump as a reference guide. Each of these bolts are different and have specific locations. The new pump will allow you to remember each of the locations or the bolts. The lower idler pulley does need to be removed in order to gain access to the water pump bolt behind it. The upper idler pulley also needs to be removed in order to fully remove that pump. Now the pump can be removed. Again, be careful. Coolant will most likely dump out of the pump when it's removed. Here's a view once everything has been removed as a reference. With the old coolant in the system, using a hose, I gave the block a flush to ensure any older coolant or sediment is removed from the system. It's always a good idea to do this so you're able to achieve maximum performance on your cooling system and minimizing potential problems in the future. Make sure you're not using overly high pressure from the hose. I also wrapped a rag around the tip to provide somewhat of a seal when pushing the water through. I went in both directions. Sometimes stuff will only wash out in one direction. Then using a scouring pad rated at 600 grit, the sealing surface is cleaned. Here you can see all the bolts are laid out on the new pump. This is transferred over to the old pump. You can also use a cardboard template if you wish. Now here's the new pump. No gasket is required as it already has one supplied. I tried to purchase a pump with a metal impeller, which I prefer. However, this one ended up coming with a plastic impeller. Metal impellers tend to be more reliable, however they can be hard to find. Wipe down the water pump area with a clean cloth. Now install the new pump and install some of the bolts to hold it into place. All the bolts are ran in by hand first, so nothing is cross-threaded. The bolts can be cleaned up using a wire brush before the installation to make everything a little easier. All the bolts are then snugged up first, so the pump is seated in place. For tightening the pump, I worked from the center first, then slowly worked my way around in a circle, all the way out to the outer bolts. The torque specifications for these bolts is 18 foot-pounds or 14 Newton meters. For working on vehicles yourself, either at home or in the field, eManual has dealer-grade repair manuals available for any vehicle you're working on. Detailed illustrations and information making sure you don't miss any important points and are ready to tackle any job. eManual Online has hooked me up with a 20% discount code for site-wide. It's for DIY ERS 20. Make sure you use my referral link in the video description. This will allow me to make a percentage for each sale to help keep my channel going. When each of the bolts are finalized, due to the irregular locations, I used a paint marker to keep track. The heater core lines are reconnected. Those spring clamps are replaced with proper gear clamps and tightened. If you are transferring over the thermostat with housing, it's held on with 2 bolts. I did, however, purchase a new thermostat and housing. These housings can rust and develop a pinhole causing a leak. Again, preventative maintenance. Now for installing the new thermostat, there will be a small bypass hole. This is to allow the coolant to flow through and for any air to escape. This must be facing at the 12 o'clock position. The thermostat will have its own temperature rating printed on it somewhere. Install the new thermostat. There is already a new gasket pre-installed. Next is a housing, then install the 2 bolts. Snug them down, working between the 2 bolts so the housing can be pulled down together evenly. The torque specifications for these bolts is 112 inch-pounds or 13 Newton meters. I found the older tensioner and pulleys to be worn. They were replaced as well. This can also be done as preventative maintenance. A worn idler pulley won't turn smoothly. You may hear clicking or grinding. A worn tensioner may not keep sufficient tension on the belt, causing the belt to bounce. The torque specifications for the tensioner is 30 foot-pounds or 41 newton meters. The idler pulley specs are 40 foot-pounds or 54 newton meters. Install the new Serpentine belt. First, it's routed around and placed on the ribbed pulleys. It's easy to install it on the pulleys that are smoothest last. Once it's in place, then use the ratchet to pull the tensioner back and install it on the final pulley. Here's the new radiator as a reference. Make sure the drain plug is closed. You can see the two bolt holes at the top and the rubber grommets where it fits into the brackets at the bottom. The new radiator is then installed. Be extremely careful not to damage the fins. Push those rubber grommets into their holes at the bottom. Then install the AC condenser before it's bolted into place. The lower rad hose is then installed on the water pump and radiator. As mentioned earlier, the factory spring clamps are being replaced with gear clamps. To remove the fan for transferring it onto the new clutch fan, I used a pipe wrench to lock the pulley into place against the water pump casing. Using a large wrench, I broke the old clutch fan free. This method will bend the pulley, making it no longer usable. Once removed, I can then remove the 4 bolts holding on the fan. Install the fan onto the new clutch and tighten those bolts. The torque specifications for these bolts is 18 foot-pounds or 24 newton meters. Install and tighten those bolts for the alternator and AC compressor brace. The torque specifications for these bolts is 21 foot-pounds or 28 newton meters. Install the oil cooler along with the 2 nuts and bolts. The fan shroud is then put back into place. Then the clutch fan assembly is installed and threaded onto the water pump. The torque specification for this is 37 foot-pounds or 50 newton meters. Install the bolts for the fan shroud. Put the coolant and washer reservoir back into place, connect the hoses and electrical plugs. The upper radiator hose gets installed along with the new gear clamps. My cold air intake shroud is then installed along with the brackets. If you have an air box, then install that instead. Install the intake tube. It's connected onto the throttle body, the sensor is pushed back into place, as well as the bracket. Now is replenishing the system with coolant. Here I'm using my OEM Tools model number 87043 No Spill Coolant Funnel Kit. Included is 5 spring-loaded adapters for various vehicles, various attachments to work on those awkward areas, built-in stopper to prevent it from dripping when removed, and an air release vent for filling and bleeding the air. A must-have for professionals in the field or those working at home. A link to this will be included in the video description to Mobile Distributor Supply. The system will require about a 50-50 mixture of coolant and distilled water. This can be adjusted slightly depending on your climate, as this will affect the boiling and freezing points of your coolant. Only use distilled water in the cooling system as there is no additives or minerals which may cause problems in your cooling system down the road. As you can see, when the funnel is filling up, air is slowly escaping from the system. You can squeeze the upper and lower radiator hoses to help push out any air from the system. Fill the system until the level no longer drops in the funnel. Once the level stays the same, make sure the vehicle is on level ground, turn your fan on the full position and the heater at the hottest setting, then start the engine and watch the level. Monitor the level of coolant. If it drops, add more. Only keep about a couple inches of coolant in the funnel and wait until the engine comes up to full operating temperature. Watch the gauge constantly so the engine doesn't overheat. Once the level is no longer dropping, turn the engine off and let it sit until it cools down. When the fluid is hot, it'll expand. Once it cools down, it'll contract and you'll need to add more coolant. I warmed the engine up again and repeated this process just to be safe. Then let it cool down again. The valve in the center of the funnel is pushed closed when there is still coolant inside. It's removed from the radiator and this is dumped into the reservoir tank. The reservoir tank should be between the minimum and maximum lines, so add more if necessary. Go back and tightening those gear clamps may be required when the engine cools down. Then check for any leaks. If none are found, you're officially done. New videos released every week on my channel. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button. It's a huge help to me, and leave a comment below if you found this tutorial helpful. If you're not a subscriber, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching.